Okay, hello.
Ask me if you can hear us.
Can you hear me, Connor? I'm like, we're like friends now. Me and Connor go way back.
Yeah, I could hear you.
Okay, thanks, Connor.
All right.
All right, so then this is this.
Yeah. Oh, right here. Okay. Can't go into the.
We're not allowed to open this.
I saw
Yeah, I
that.
see people are very strict with it, effectively.
I don't blame them. Silly.
So
You good?
Connor, if you would mute yourself. There you go. Thank you. So maybe as people come in, are you cool seeing that up there and like doing that? Or do you want,
Oh yeah.
or I could grab my laptop and do it. Oop, doesn't
Yeah.
open. Okay.
Sorry, I just thought I put it on the. Just trying to see where the thing ended up.
Oh,
Thought I put it right on here, but maybe I didn't. Oh, there's a file already there.
there it is.
All right.
I was totally didn't ask you if you want me to introduce you. So do you want to just start? Is that okay?
Yeah, I can get
Introduce
just
yourself.
started. Yeah. Let me just see where this goes. Oh,
Yeah.
is it not doing? Sorry, let me do. I was supposed to do presenter view. Is it not doing it? Oh, let me see something real quick.
And I'm totally crowding you because I just need to share on the Zoom. your
Yeah,
slides
yeah.
when you're ready.
I'll
Do you know
make
how to do
sure.
it?
Uh-huh.
Okay, I'm gonna walk in.
Although I thought it was extending it. I might not see all my notes. Oh well. So usually that's supposed to just share it. So we're gonna get started here in just a moment for those who are joined. Let me. Okay. Oh, it's just lying to me every time I do that. It just doesn't. It doesn't actually extend, does it? It's all right. It'll be fine. I won't get to see my secret notes though as I'm presenting, but all right, I'll share the screen and we'll get started here. Sorry, let me find the.
Your slides.
Yeah, I should be sharing it. I just need to move into the full size. Yep.
Thank you, Adam.
All right, and let me just double check. So those who are watching, you guys can see the slides then just fine on your screen as well. I guess Connor, I'll ask you to unmute since I was talking to you earlier. You're good?
I can see them.
All right. Okay, let's get started. So welcome everybody. I bring a big crowd. I'm Adam Dines. I'm a professor of political science at Brigham Young University. And mostly what I study is about representation, how elected officials in government represent their constituents. And a lot of my work also on representation deals with local politics and especially municipal politics. And so here, what we're kind of looking at is, trying to get why local elections matter. And, you might also question, or do they, right? And that'll be left, I guess, to all of you to end up deciding how you think it ends up in the end here. Well, I don't have as big of a crowd to ask like some of the biggest news stories of the year. I don't know how much you on Zoom want to chime in, but yeah, so some of the biggest news stories of the year. COVID, yeah. Okay, the last couple of, what else? Elections, like the presidential election, yeah, big deal. Okay, any other things that on people's lists? Or even chat, Okay, no, okay. All right, so yeah, I'd say COVID's big on the list. Some other ones, though, I think also that we've probably thought a lot about. So Black Lives Matter protests, right, across the country, another big issue after the death of George Floyd. And by some reports, supposed to be the largest social movement in US history, with somewhere between 6 or 10% of people reporting having participated in a protest. Okay. And this is often a local matter ultimately, right? Like these are concerns about policing and how policing operates. And that is often very much a local matter. State politics is involved in it as well, but it's mostly state and especially local. After the election, right, where we have a riot and a mob trying to stop the certification election in the US Congress on January 6th, right? Again, I mean, it's easy to see, oh, isn't this like a federal matter? Yes, but at the same time, it's local offices in most states that are determining who won and certifying and saying, okay, this is who got this % of the vote. And it was local election officials, many of them elected, who were also pushing back against these claims that that Trump had actually won, right? And so again, it's tying back to local politics, even this big national issue. And then COVID, as you guys mentioned, worldwide phenomenon. But then at the same time, a lot of decisions that are made about how to address COVID are at the local level, right? So here's kind of from Salt Lake Tribune article about protesters interrupting a Granite School Board meeting, upset about mask requirements in schools. And, you know, ultimately the state legislature kind of took the decision out from the local schools, but they still put it at a county level decision, which is still local government. So, so even on some of these biggest stories and political events, they still involve local government in many ways. And at the same time, local governments also deal with, I'd say, kind of these everyday and mundane issues that are still important. So for example, does anyone know what this is a picture of? I just took I didn't drive over here before I came to Weber State. It is, you can probably tell it's somewhere in the valley here in the county. It's just a Google Scholar shot. I'm not gonna have the full name of it because I'm not seeing my notes here, but it's just a Weber County area like sanitation facility, right? It seems kind of mundane. But there's like often boards that run these who are elected local boards, and they're in charge of cleaning our water and giving us a clean water supply, which again is something we don't think much about, but really affects our quality of life. Schooling is another, K-12 education. Something like 90% of students in K-12 students attend public schools here in Utah. Again, that's a local politics matter, but just lots of things dealing just with the quality of life. And here, showing pictures from Ogden, and I have not driven through the "It pays to live in Ogden" sign, so maybe I should do that on my way out. I do think that's a really sweet sign. So we have someone else joining us here. But just quality of life, like the shops, the retail, the streets you drive on, the lighting, the parks, all sorts of different community events, libraries. Again, local politics, I think sometimes we forget about. And so one thing I hope you're taking away from this is local government and politics matter. But do local elections, right? That's a slightly different question, or even like your decision to vote in these local elections. So, and there's lots of reasons why local elections may not really matter, may not have a big impact on local policies that we think are important. One is there's this concern that maybe local officials and city officials are mostly catering to wealthy interests, and we'll talk a bit more about why that might be the case. Or there's this other, I think, kind of bigger concern about, or other, I guess, bigger reason why local elections may not matter is because you get to choose where you live. And so you're going to be able to choose governments that already line up with your preferences in many ways. And so whether you vote or not, you might end up in a place that already reflects your preferences without you ever having to learn about local politics. But I'm going to try to make the case here that local elections still matter. It can have an impact on the quality of government that we have and representation. Okay. So just kind of like an outline, what we'll be going through. So we'll go a little bit more about why local governments matter. We'll think about, do local policies even reflect citizens' preferences? And if they do, then that might suggest that elections do matter. And then we'll look at research on how much do elections change this pattern, this relationship between preferences of voters and policy outcomes. We'll think about some other ways that elections might matter. And then though, even if, who shows up to vote affects policy outcomes, but what about you as an individual? Does your individual vote matter when it's just you among thousands of people? And then just I'll have some closing thoughts too about how politics is for power. And this I think especially applies to local politics and kind of what I mean by that. So that was our introduction. Let's talk a little bit more about why local governments matter. So like I've already kind of mentioned already, they deal with a lot of issues that affect our daily lives. And in fact, it's probably the level of government we interact the most with. Like every time we set out, well, just living, we're living in cities, most of us, and using those services provided by the cities, right? That directly affect our quality of life. Local governments are spending about a quarter of government spending. A big chunk of that is K-12 education. So we're going to focus more on cities today. They also hire about 63% of all government employees. Again, a big chunk of that is our teachers and people working in the K-12 education system. This is showing the number of elected officials in the United States. This is from data from 1992. It doesn't look, I don't think it looks a ton different from this. It's probably the case there's even more special purpose districts. But as we look at this, right, we focus so much on the federal government, right, where we have this total of 542 elected officials. But forget that when we get down to local governments, we're talking about 500,000 elected officials across the US, representing almost 90,000 governments, right? We have county governments, we have municipal, we have towns and townships. Usually these don't overlap, except when you're in New York, and that really messes with getting data. I just have to tell you. Okay, but you have school districts, right, with nearly 14,000, and again, 88,000 school board members elected, and then special districts as well. We really like elections in the US. Like we are election happy. I don't think there's other countries that compete with us on this front. But so lots of local governments. This is just showing by county the number of levels of governments that are like over you in each like kind of county. So for example, in some places like in Arizona, you're going to have anywhere between 7 and 70 levels of government with special districts, and a district for the mosquito abatement district, and you have your water district, you have your library district, your school district, then your municipal government, your county government, your state government. So lots of levels of government in the US. And when we look at where people live, right, most of us live in cities. So we have about maybe like 15%. This is from the 2000 census. Again, I don't think this has changed drastically since then. About 15% of people living in unincorporated outside of city boundaries. But that means like 85%, right? We're living within cities. And not only that, we're mostly living in small and medium-sized towns and cities, right? So Ogden, for example, is right here, right? It's in the 50,000 to 100,000 with 90,000 people. And even often when we think about local politics, we're often thinking about this like kind of top left quadrant here, this quarter of the biggest cities. But again, most of us don't live in those big cities. And throughout the talk, just to kind of clarify, if I say city or municipality, I'll use those terms interchangeably, just meaning sub-county general purpose governments, right? So cities, towns, villages, townships. There are a few cities and towns that have merged with their county government, like New York City. But anyway, so I'll include, those are included as well when I just say city, municipality. Okay. And somewhat ironically, it's the level of government we know the least about in political science. And when we do know a lot about local politics, it's often the big cities that are important, but aren't where most of Americans live. So yeah, it's kind of a little bit sad there. And so sorry, I should go back. There's been I think a growing body of work in political science, and I have been participating in this research, is trying to better understand local politics and using lots of data to do so. And so we're going to explore some of this together today. So again, a lot of times our focus, both as citizens and consumers of news and as researchers and scholars, is on national politics. But I think it's also important that we don't forget about municipal politics as well. And here's, Ogden City Hall and South Ogden. I want to give you an example of one that's not so grand. I have to say, Ogden's municipal building is a good-looking Art Deco building. I was very impressed. So, as well as the high school. Okay, so let's talk about, well, do local policies even reflect citizens' preferences? Okay, because earlier research in urban politics just didn't expect to see these local policies to reflect citizens' preferences. They just thought, that they could ignore the preferences of a lot of the voters, and that in fact they kind of needed to, that they were under pressure to do so. And one of the reasons why you may not expect to see policy outcomes at the city level line up with citizens' preferences is because of the constraints on local policymaking by national laws and regulations and state laws and regulations. Okay, and this is particularly important with states because cities are creatures of the state, right? They exist because the state allows them to exist. They have a lot of ability to constrain what cities do and don't do. Okay, and even though, again, I still believe cities, deal with important issues, even if they are constrained. But again, there's state laws that dictate what they can and can't do. Another reason why we might not see this congruence or this correlation between preferences of the citizens and policy outcomes is because maybe officials feel a lot of pressure to be responsive to businesses and wealthy citizens. Okay, so cities need revenue, they need tax revenue, and businesses and wealthy citizens can be more mobile, right? Have more options of where to live and can leave if they're not happy or never go to that city in the first place, right? So Trader Joe's, for example, had announced that they were going to build a grocery store somewhere in the Provo-Orem area down by BYU. And the cities really competed to try to get Trader Joe's. I have a colleague who did a survey of citizens in Provo, and they're asking them, do you think it'd be okay for the city to give tax breaks to businesses? And generally in Provo, right, it's a pretty conservative place. And a lot of times like, no, that would be inappropriate. We don't want these tax breaks. I think that's nothing to do with being conservative. I think lots of generally citizens would think that way. But then he asked in the survey, well, what if it was to get Trader Joe's? And all of a sudden they didn't care. They're like, do whatever you have to do to get Trader Joe's, right? And so businesses, again, they can have a lot of influence on the policies and regulations of local businesses. That's the concern here, because again, those cities need that revenue that businesses and wealthy citizens bring. And then the other reason why maybe you don't see much of a correlation between preferences of voters and city policies is maybe just because city policies are kind of above our normal politics, this liberal conservative divide, because they're technical, they're administrative, right? Do people have strong preferences on approaches to park maintenance? Maybe they know they want a park, but how you actually maintain them, I'm not sure they care. Or on how the water treatment's done, as long as the water's clean, garbage collection. I'll push back a bit on this a little bit, but these are kind of ideas about why you may not even see a correlation between the preferences of voters and outcomes at the city level, okay? And so if this is the case, if you don't really see a correlation between preferences of voters or citizens and outcomes, well, that would pretty strongly suggest that local elections don't matter that much after all, that kind of cities just do whatever they want to do. So there's a really important paper done by Chris Tasanovich and Chris Warshaw, where they try to examine this by gathering a lot of data. And in particular, they took just hundreds and hundreds of surveys that are out there that have been taken prior to this, in the early 2000s, up to 2010, 2012. And then they were able to use that to estimate the preferences of voters and do so even at the local level, down to cities of 20,000 people. There's a lot of statistics behind these estimates, but it was really groundbreaking for the study of local politics. And then what they're able to do is, well, let's compare the preferences of residents to actual policy outcomes. And again, they went out and found measures of different policies that cities had in place. Okay. And so here, what you're looking at, sorry, this thing's always kind of going to be in the way, huh? This is the measure of the kind of ideological preferences of residents in these cities. These are cities above like 200,000 or so. Okay, so on the left, so this measure, they call it city conservatism. So the higher the number, that means the more conservative the residents are. The lower the number, the more liberal. Okay, and this is kind of showing, I'm taking some of the biggest and, sorry, the most conservative and most liberal of the bigger cities, right? And in some ways, no surprise. Okay, so San Francisco, turns out estimated as the most liberal city in the country, right? Mesa, Arizona, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, right? If you know much about these cities, you wouldn't be surprised that, okay, yeah, they're showing up as more conservative, right? And some of you might say, well, thanks, political science. Like, yeah, you just told us San Francisco is liberal. Like, thanks, we realize that. But this allows us to look at all like cities from 20,000 and up and try to compare them to each other in terms of the ideology of the residents, which hadn't really been done before. And we haven't been able to achieve this. And this is, again, really groundbreaking. I'm showing you here now are just the top 30 most conservative cities in the US. To show you there are some that are more conservative than like Mesa, right? And you see a lot of states, Utah and Texas seem to show up a lot. So I think the estimate on Cedar City, by the way, is probably a little bit off, but the other ones I can buy. Right? These are some of the more conservative cities. Okay, so then what they do is they say, okay, well, let's take our measure of how conservative the cities are. Sorry, let's get this out of the way. And compare them to different policy outcomes. So again, what we have here on the x-axis is how conservative the residents are, negative numbers being very liberal, positive numbers being more conservative, okay? Compared to this policy scale is mostly measuring environmental sustainability and some like land use policies is what they're able to find. But you generally see this correlation, right? Where a positive correlation where as the residents become more conservative, the policies also become more conservative, okay? You can look at something like taxes per capita, right? And you would generally say, well, how do conservatives feel about taxes? And it's like, oh, they generally want taxes to be lower. And you see this, right? Again, you see this correlation where taxes are lower, the more conservative the city is. There's still a lot of variation around these estimates, right? So over here, like you could have a kind of a middle of the road city, and some of them might have quite liberal policy, and some of them might have quite conservative policy. But still, we see this pattern, this correlation between preferences of voters and outcomes. Okay. You can look at share of taxes from sales taxes. That's seen as like a more regressive form of taxation, but the conservatives generally favor more sales taxes. And again, we see the same pattern. Expenditures per capita, we see generally conservative places are spending less, and the most liberal places are spending quite a bit more per citizen. This is just kind of zoomed in, again, showing the same kind of patterns. That's not just driven by outliers. So going back to what we were talking about before, how there's these concerns that local policies wouldn't even reflect the preferences of residents. Well, this research, and there's been follow-up research since then, shows that actually they do correlate, right? That, okay, so even if national state governments have constraints, apparently it's not too constraining, right? There's still lots of room and leeway for different tax and spending levels. Yeah, I think it's still the case that businesses and wealthy citizens are more mobile, but maybe not mobile enough, right? Maybe the wealthy's preferences also differ across cities. And so people who are wealthier and have more liberal policy preferences move to more liberal cities, okay? Or maybe also the preferences of the wealthy and less wealthy line up in a lot of ways, especially on city matters. And then, city policies can be technical or administrative, sure, but, conservatives generally still like lower taxes, whether it's Congress or their city that's implementing or asking for those taxes, and liberals generally favor more services provided by government. And we're seeing those differences across cities, and that it correlates with the preferences of voters. Okay, All right, so we kind of at least cleared one bar to kind of show that elections might matter by showing that policies reflect citizens' preferences to some degree. But still, does this mean local elections matter? So let's kind of turn to that and see, kind of delve into this a bit. So there's kind of two key reasons why local elections may not matter. Okay. Again, like we already talked about, we've covered both of these. And the first one we've crossed out, right? It seems like, okay, they might be doing this to some degree, but it doesn't explain everything that's happening with local policies and outcomes. So the other thing about, well, you can, there's still this other thing though, where you can choose where to live. So you might end up with a government that lines up with your preferences without you needing to really vote, or people with elections not mattering that much for this. So here, for example, is a map where they try to plot basically the results from the 2016 presidential election for every precinct across the US. So I'm showing you here for this area, right? We're looking at Weber and part of Davis counties. We can also look at Salt Lake County, right? And you see some patterns there that you probably expect, right? So you get to the middle of Ogden, and there were a higher percentage of people voting for Hillary Clinton, and Salt Lake City even higher, right? It's more liberal in this area, getting more conservative in the south of the county and down in the Utah County, okay? And so what I'm trying to point out here is, well, if you have more liberal conservative preferences that also maybe reflect differences in the services these cities provide, you have some options of where to live, right? And so if you got a job in either of these areas and you're more liberal, you might, want to, you're probably more likely to decide to live in Salt Lake City, not necessarily though, but right. Or if you're more conservative, and it's also kind of correlates with preferences for urban and rural living and suburban living, correlates with people's partisanship. So if you're more conservative, you get a job in the Salt Lake area, you might want to live down, you might just choose to live down in Lehigh or Riverton or Harriman and have a bit more of a commute, or further out from Ogden if your job is up here, okay? Anyway, so you don't have to vote in local elections to end up with a city that reflects your preferences. And I think a lot of people kind of already know what cities reflect their preferences. And so this previous work I talked about by Chris Stefanovich, Chris Warshaw, also examines a bit of whether other institutions in the city affect the pattern that we see, this correlation between preferences of voters and policy outcomes. They fail to find that the different institutions really matter. They looked at whether a city has mayors versus city managers, right? You might think mayors will have a stronger incentive to really be responsive to voters so they get reelected, whereas a city manager is kind of buffered from the preferences of voters. Whether they have term limits versus not, that's up in the air about how you think term limits might affect things. A referendum, right? Like you're able to have referendum, you think, okay, well, that's really going to lead policy to reflect what voters want because they can vote on policy, right? Or district elections versus at-large elections. There's arguments back and forth about why those might lead to a better representation, a better match. And then partisan elections versus nonpartisan. So about 75% of cities have nonpartisan elections. And you think, well, with partisan elections, well, you have this shortcut given to you to know if an elected official or candidate is going to line up with your preferences. If you're a Republican, the candidate's Republican, it's probably a decent bet that the Republican kind of lines up with your preferences. Although, be careful, sometimes it gets thrown off a bit in local politics. There's some research on that. In any case, but here what I want to point out is they mostly don't find a difference between cities with or without these different institutions. So this is, for example, with partisan elections. The black line are for cities that have partisan elections, the gray line and gray circles are those of nonpartisan. And we kind of see like the correlation still looks kind of the same, right? We don't see like a different pattern. I mean, you see a little bit of a different pattern here with expenditures per capita. That's like out where there's hardly any observations, but where you have lots of observations, like the lines are very similar, okay? Even though it's kind of hard to see that gray line. Yeah, I should tell Chris that, like, come on, guys. You should have done a black dash. No, or anyway, there's other options they could have done so you can see those lines. In any case, but in their analysis, they're missing a very important institution, which is election timing. Okay, so most cities hold their elections, and this is like, again, about 75% of cities hold their elections off cycle or they're non-concurrent with state and national elections. So that's what we mean. So if I say off cycle, or if you see a figure that says non-concurrent, it's meaning it doesn't line up with state or national elections. So that's the case in Utah. All of those local elections are in, or the general election for local elections is November of odd years, whereas all the state and national elections are November of even years. Some places it's April, it's all over the place across the country. So you might think, well, how might this affect voter turnouts, right? And it generally leads to lower turnout, okay? So this is from a book on local elections where they're trying to look across 500 cities, but there's other work that shows this as well. So for example, here's turnout across these cities in 2006, and if they have their elections lining up with national elections, okay, what they find is, oh, you have about like 50% turnout if it's in 2006, sorry. So that could be, sometimes you even have elections in like spring of even years. But if the election is concurrent and was in 2006, turnout was 55.6% on average. If it didn't line up with national elections, it dropped down to 18. And then this is, again, turnout in 2005, it's higher in these places, 35%. And then again, turnout in 2004, right? If it's concurrent, turnout 76%. If it doesn't line up with national elections, it drops down, like it's cut in half. Often is what you see, half or more. Okay. It was very common, for example, in Provo, I was like, turnout was often 10%. Okay, historically, people showing up to vote. Okay, so turnout really drops. I have to can I share like a quick story? So at the end of my finishing up my PhD, I'm already doing some work on local politics. I'm doing surveys of local politicians. I'm attending like my city council meetings because I'm both out of interest as being a resident in this particular city, a small town, North Haven, just north of New Haven, Connecticut. And anyways, I'm showing up partly out of my own interest as a citizen, but also just to get a sense of local politics and how things kind of operate and get a better sense of it. Anyway, as I'm doing this, there is going to be an election, and it's going to be an election where the city will vote on whether to approve the town budget. So this is very common in New England, where citizens actually approve the budget through an election. And I completely forgot to go. Like, I was at the city council meetings leading up to the budget. It was very contentious and divisive. And I forgot the day of. I went in to do my research and work and other things, and I went home and had dinner, and I just forgot. And then I got a job teaching at BYU. I'm teaching my first semester where it's state and local politics. It's 2015. I even take my class to go to a candidate debate that was on campus for the city council. And I also forgot to vote that day. Totally forgot. And I verified it. After that happened, I didn't, years later, I'd be like, did I vote then or not? I can't remember. Well, I got a hold of a voter file where you can see whether people showed up to vote or not. I did not vote as I was teaching class on state and local politics, because you just forget. It's not in the news. It's not in your social media feed in the same ways. And unless you're a little bit more connected to your community. So yeah. And so in my own research, I find that the fact that turnout is lower also affects policy outcomes, right? And this pattern between policy outcomes and citizens' preferences, okay? And so what we do here is we're basically taking kind of the same data from that other research. We're using the same measure of how conservative to liberal, right, on the left are the citizens, and we're looking at different policy outcomes, right? But we're now looking at whether or not we're comparing the pattern for cities that have off-cycle elections, which is the darker gray, versus those that have on-cycle, which is the lighter gray with the dashed line, okay? And so what you see here with expenditures per capita, you see a somewhat similar pattern of taxes per capita, is that when the elections are on cycle, so they line up with state and national elections, turnout's probably likely higher, you see the slope is steeper. So as the city gets more conservative, it more quickly, the tax rates per capita drop more quickly. Whereas for those that are off cycle, It's almost the same. Like you hardly see any change from the most liberal city to the most conservative in terms of taxes per capita. Similar with expenditures per capita, you see a little bit more change even when it's off cycle, but again, that change is bigger when the elections are on cycle, which suggests that the timing of the election has an impact on policy outcomes. And what drives this result? What is driving this? We're studying in this paper specifically the effects of organized groups and interest groups, and arguing that they're likely to be able to have a bigger impact when elections are off cycle because turnout is lower. And so elected officials might be less concerned about the preferences of voters. And so we look specifically at outcomes relevant to public employees because this is one of the most active and organized groups in city politics. And it's also a group for which we kind of have a sense of what their policy preferences are, and there's measures of those. But we might think a similar pattern and see some similar results if we look at some other interest groups like businesses and developers, which are also very important interest groups in city politics. Okay, and so what we find here is on an issue that's particularly salient and important to city employees, we see again the similar pattern. This is we're looking at the expenditures per capita on salaries, right? Whether you hire more employees or pay them more, this number will go up. So if you look in conservative places, so for example, we have more conservative voters, you see when their elections are on cycle, they're paying less, they're spending less on salaries, but when they're off cycle, like in the most conservative places, they're almost doubling how much they're spending on salaries. Okay? And so that suggests that maybe the interest group is better able to get what they want because of the election timing. Now, on the other hand, you kind of might be confused about, well, what's happening here, right? What's happening in these liberal cities? You might think, oh, well, shouldn't interest groups get even more of what they want even when they're off cycle? Well, the one thing to keep in mind with local elections is there is a constituency that often always shows up to vote. It's usually older and wealthier voters who want lower taxes and less spending generally. And so kind of our thought here is that in liberal cities, if they had on-cycle elections, they would have even more liberals showing up to vote, right? But because they're off-cycle, when they're off-cycle though, the electorate ends up looking more conservative than it would otherwise. Anyway, but again, the bigger point here is just to highlight how election timing affects policy outcomes, which suggests that elections matter. You can see a similar pattern with school board elections, right? Where they find that school boards with off-cycle elections have higher salaries for teachers, but not superintendents. And why is this? Well, teachers are a much larger proportion of voters than superintendents, and especially when elections are off cycle. So this is research by Sarah and Zia. She's done this looking at different states, and she's done some on Texas. She's done some looking at Minnesota specifically, because we see it varies, right, across states when they hold their elections. But across all of these states, what she ends up finding is, salaries are a little bit higher. It's like, we're just 1.6%, 4%. Higher when you have off-cycle elections. Okay? And this is another thing to say whether or not public employees and teachers should be paid more or less. It's more just to highlight, hey, the timing of election is affecting some policy outcomes at the local level, which then that suggests that local elections matter to some degree, that they can impact things. So let's see, I'll skip ahead a bit. Okay. Other ways that elections can matter, and this is in similar ways here. I want to highlight like an example I think that people are probably still familiar with. This is showing you Ferguson, Missouri, in the metropolitan area of St. Louis. Okay, and I think we're familiar with the protests and the riots that broke out. Again, resulting from a police officer shooting a Black man, right? But it wasn't just about, I think, the death of a civilian here. I think there's also some underlying tensions in how the city was run as well, right? And this is a graphic showing you the race of everybody in America. This is actually a really cool map where they plotted out using census data, and they break it down by census blocks. And so they just say, okay, well, let's say this is a census block, like right here, this little part of Ferguson, Missouri. And let's say there's 200 people that live there and it's 90% Black. Then what they do is they put 200 dots in that space, and then just kind of randomly they're in that space, and 90% of them, they'll have them, Black, and 10% the color for whites, right? So green are Black residents, blue are white, non-Hispanic, orange are Hispanic, red are Asian, okay? And here in Ferguson, Missouri, demographics, it's like 2/3 African-American, okay? And like I'm saying here, I think the protests and riots, they're also driven by some deep frustrations with city government in Ferguson, right? And so, for example, the city relied heavily on fees and fines for tax revenue, and that were often paid by low-income and African-American citizens. A lot of them felt like preyed upon and getting stopped for any small infraction, anyways, and getting fined for it. And, it seems clear, it seemed like their views were not being represented well. And only 1 out of 6 city councilors at the time were African-American when the protests happened. And, any guesses about when Ferguson held their elections? Yeah, it was off cycle, right? And it didn't line up with national elections. And so here's like the turnout, for example, in 2012, a presidential election, where turnout is pretty similar between African-Americans and whites in the city. Here it is, though, in the 2013 municipal elections. I think that the protests and riots were in 2014. Okay, you see turnout is it's lower among everybody, and especially lower among African Americans. So this is looking at then the composition of the electorate, right? So African Americans go from being 71% of those showing up to vote down to just a little bit under half. Okay, and so one reason why it might have been that they're underrepresented is because of when election timing was held, and people's propensity to turn out to vote. Okay, and this is some data. This is actually a graph that one of my undergraduate research assistants putting together on a project he's working on with me, and where we've gathered a bunch of data on the race of city council members across the US from probably 20,000 something cities. And then we're comparing then like what proportion of the city council are racial minorities compared to the portion of the city. And then in this case, they're looking at how it varies based on whether they have district elections or at-large elections. And I'll save that for another time. But more why I'm showing this is to point out that generally what you see here is even when racial minorities are 60% of the population, they're usually about half of the city council is also non-white, right? And so you're always seeing like they're a bit of underrepresentation for racial minorities in city politics, and that how you do your elections also might affect that, having district versus at large. And why does this matter? Well, it matters for several reasons. In general, racial minorities have slightly more liberal preferences than white residents in cities. Also, neighborhoods and cities are often segregated by race, right? Still, for a host of reasons. And so they might have different preferences about local policies that affect neighborhoods differently. So you can even look at this, for example, this is looking again at Weber County, or parts of it. We have Ogden, right? And so you have pockets where there's a lot of Hispanic residents, right? And so, and I bet, there's things that this part of town might want and favor that other parts of town, might want some other kind of policy. Or like if there's a park and you can only get, only have enough money for one more park, like which neighborhood is going to get that park, right? Okay. And I find in some of my other research that local officials favor neighborhoods with high turnout. So this is a paper where I did a survey experiment on elected officials. I surveyed a bunch of municipal officials. Kind of the short version is basically I had them try to choose like which neighborhood would they target with some spending. They had them imagine that they were a campaign manager for a city councilor who's trying to figure out which neighborhood should get this particular project. Okay, this is like a local road repair, and I varied some things about the neighborhoods, right? So, for example, neighborhood 1 might be like full of supporters for this city councilor, or it might be swing, and the other neighborhood was the opposite. Or the neighborhood might have really high turnout versus really low turnout. Okay, and then they kind of ask them, okay, which neighborhood do you think, Mr. Smith should target for the project? And the thing I want to point out here is that panel B is just the overwhelming majority, especially if they're thinking about this in terms of elections, are saying you should choose the high turnout neighborhood, like 82%. Okay, so again, there's some evidence that they favor those who vote. So again, so turning out to vote affects how your community is represented. Yeah, and there's an incentive for elected officials, electoral incentives from the target and benefit neighborhoods with high turnout. So now the question is, okay, so even if you're convinced that elections matter to some degree, what about you individually? Should you show up to vote? Okay. And one concern might be that your vote doesn't really matter that much. So there's this famous kind of formula or model of trying to look at the costs and benefits of voting called the calculus of voting. We're trying to understand is what is the utility you get from showing up to vote? Like what's the usefulness of voting to you? How much satisfaction will you get from it? And there's an argument that it's a function of this probability, the P term, the probability that your vote is decisive, it's pivotal, that how you vote decides who's going to win, that it all comes down to your vote times the benefits you would get if your candidate wins. And we're talking here like government benefits. So let's say, if your candidate won, it would be, your neighborhood, you feel like would get the street repairs, or you'd get the park, or taxes would be lowered, or taxes would be raised to provide services that you might benefit from. Okay. But then you also have to consider the cost of voting. Okay. And the reason we're multiplying these benefits times the probability that your vote's decisive, the argument is basically, well, if your vote doesn't decide the outcome, then it doesn't really matter who you voted for. It's not going to affect the benefits you get. So if a candidate wins by thousands of votes, right? Let's say they win by 2,000 votes, whether or not you vote for that candidate or not, now the candidate, if you don't vote for them, now the candidate wins by 1,999 votes instead of 2,000. Right? So you voting for them, they still would have won. So you could have voted for Mickey Mouse and the outcome wouldn't have changed. And it wouldn't affect kind of the benefits that you get from your candidate winning. Okay? But then you're facing though lots of costs of voting. Right? So the probability of being pivotal is basically almost always zero. Okay. So that means this is mostly equal in this formula. And so what you're left with are the costs of voting, the cost of showing up, the cost of registering, the cost of being informed. And the cost of being informed can be really high. And so you have a strong incentive to not vote. And so we see a lot of people not voting. But, especially in local elections, but at the same time, there's been some close to local elections, right? So I just looked up, in Ogden from the last few years. So like in 2007, this is pretty close, right? That's a pretty close election. And we were talking to, like, if a bunch of students had organized and shown up to vote, boom, you could have had an impact on who was the mayor. And the mayor might have thought, oh, maybe I should think more about, what the concerns of students are, for example. Okay. Or this vote right here, another really close one, right? Just a little over 200 votes. This one as well. 2007, there were a lot of close elections that year. In 2017, okay, so the percentages are really, really big, but that's really low turnout. So if someone was really organized and got a bunch of people together, they could have had made a difference on who won that election, right? This was more recently. Okay, it didn't matter. These were not close elections because there's only one person on the ballot in all of these races. So it's still often pretty much equals zero, this number. Sometimes it's bigger than zero. Okay, so this mostly often equals zero, but we know people still vote, right? So there's something else going on. That's the D term, as it's often called, which stands for like the direct benefits of voting, the psychological benefits. Okay. And what we're talking about here is just feeling good about yourself for voting, right? And you feel like you did your duty, you did your part. Many of you have been socialized from a young age to value voting. In partisan elections, like you feel really good about voting for your party, and even better about voting against the person from the other party. may not be the most noble reasons to vote. But anyway, there's a lot of direct benefits from voting. You get the sticker, right? You avoid social shame, possibly. And kind of one thing I want to highlight here is, I think there's a lot of focus on how the calculus of voting, and this formula means you shouldn't vote. But that's if you're thinking very instrumentally, if you're just thinking about the direct benefits to yourself. But I think society would be worse off if everybody was only always thinking about how does this improve my bottom line. And so I do think it's good that we have people who also care about how their actions affect others, that they're thinking about these public goods, that they're thinking about the benefits that accrue to society at large and to themselves. And so I hope, and that at least the feelings of doing your civic duty is enough utility help get people to be more likely to vote, especially in local elections. But then it's like, well, how do I get informed? I mean, one thing I want to highlight is just register to vote. You end up on a voter file. Campaigns say, oh, that person is a registered voter. We should send them a flyer. Okay. And then if you do vote, and let's say you vote one time, you don't have a ton of info, but once you show up as a voter, campaigns will come to you. Okay, is one thing to keep in mind. There's also a lot of great voter info packets, even for local elections and state elections in particular, that it gets put together by elections.utah.gov. The other key is just finding and following people in your neighborhood or in your social circles who are involved. I think as a student, you might feel a lot more disconnected, or you feel like, oh, I'm just going to be here for a few years. You're living in the dorms, you're still living at home, you don't maybe feel as connected yet. But I think especially once you leave school and you start a career, is lay down roots in a community and get to know the people in that community, and it won't take long to find people who are involved and know what's going on. There's a guy in my neighborhood who just sends out an email to everybody about what's happening in local politics. He'd been involved, he's run for many different races, and it's been really helpful for me, even as a political scientist. The other thing I'd say is read more local news and read less national news. I know it can cost a bit of money, but even just having a subscription to the Salt Lake Tribune or other local papers. And I'll talk a bit more about why I think this is important. And another thing is just kind of showing up or watching, even online, especially neighborhood meetings. A lot of cities will have neighborhood boards that get involved in neighborhood decisions. And those are nice ways too to get involved and get to start to meet people. So let me close on talking about local politics is for power. And explain what I mean by this. And I understand some of you may still question whether it's worth it to vote and take the time and get informed. I get that. And again, I have to agree, just like being able to choose where you live will have a big impact on how you're represented. But also keep in mind, you don't always have a choice or want to move. Sometimes the place you want to live, you can't afford to be there. That's very common, I think, for very many Americans. And so then what can you do about it? I want to say it's in local politics is probably where you can have the biggest impact on many important issues. And I realize, like, I am a bit, I'm an elite by being like a professor, right, at a university. And then I know a lot of the other professors in my community, and there's always, it seems like, a professor in our neighborhood who's on the city council. So I have kind of close ties, but I think most people don't realize that how many few degrees they're away from people who are actively involved in local politics, either as a city councilor or on many of the boards, like zoning boards, and that affect land use and what gets built and what doesn't get built. Like, you're a lot closer to local politics, I think, than you realize. Anyways, and again, it's the area where I think activities can have a really big impact. But what I want to point out here and kind of end on is you have to do more than just follow politics on social media to have an impact. Okay. I think this is a trap a lot of us are in. I have a colleague of mine, Eitan Hirsch. He's not at Brigham Young University. We were at grad school. He was an assistant professor. I got to work with him a bit. He's a great scholar, and he had this really good book that came out a couple of years called "Politics is for Power: How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism, Take Action, and Make Real Change." If you just look up this article in The Atlantic, you get a free few articles a year. College-educated voters are ruining American politics. It summarizes a lot of his arguments. And it's not just college-educated voters. I mean, that includes, college-educated voters doesn't just include you right now going to college. It also includes me and your professors. And a lot of us, what we're doing, as he points out, is we're watching politics. We might even donate to a campaign. We might sign an online petition, but we're mostly consuming political information, as it says here, as a way of satisfying our own emotional and intellectual needs. These people are political hobbyists. In other words, politics for them is like a hobby. It's like watching sports. And as he says here, what they are doing is no closer to engaging in politics than watching SportsCenter is to playing football. And so one mistake I think we often fall into in a trap is we say, oh, I got to be more involved. So I'm going to get more informed. I'm going to read the local news. I'll follow some things on social media that's local news and local politics, but we don't do anything else. And we're just ranting about it and we get upset about it. But we're not doing the work it takes to make change. And that's what this, like the front of the cover illustrates that I like quite a bit is here's a person who's just talk. And the other person is kind of cutting out the talk about how we can make America better. And, you know, she's walking off, she's going to do something about it instead of just talking about it. Anyway, so if you want to make a difference in the world, this is part of what he tries to put forward in this book. It's meant for a general audience. It's a really great read. Again, you can also read articles about it. His big point is that you have to learn to work with other people. And that ultimately it can't just be following the news and people on social media. It's actually getting involved with community and political organizations, whether that's the political party, that's the food bank, that is the Rotary Club, whatever it is, just start getting involved and meeting people. Anyway, and again, it's in local politics where that kind of action I think can be most impactful. So anyway, so thank you so much. And
you want to click in the chat and see what questions there are?
yeah, I just blew past all of them. Okay. Okay. Oh, ouch, Gary, that really hurts. I'm just teasing. Yeah. Okay. So if all Muslim elections would be on cycle, wouldn't it stand to reason that it would also serve as a mobilization effect? Voters in national elections would pay more attention to local issues because they know they will be on the ballots. Yeah. No, I think so. I think that's absolutely right. I'm not necessarily though saying that we need to move elections to being on cycle, local elections, because there's other concerns as well about like, do we want to make will that make local elections be even more partisan? I think there's more work to be done to look at that. Like, what else happens to politics if you move into on cycle? Like, so yeah, you see higher turnout, but do we see some of this animosity, partisan animosity, like bleed down into local politics, where sometimes we just want to bring to the table ideas to kind of solve local problems? And so anyway, so I'm not totally sure if we should just jump over to it, but it's, yeah.
Along those lines, what's the reason why so many ended up off-site?
Oh yeah. So what? Yeah, so he's asking, why is it that we ended up with off-cycle elections to begin with? And so some of it's just like historical happenstance, but there were lots of efforts, especially by the progressives. And there's really good work by Sarah and Zia on this. She's at the public policy school at UC Berkeley, where she argues that so the progressives of the late 1800s, early 1900s, it's this movement that's trying to break up the party machines, the national party machines that are active in politics at the national level all the way down to the city level, and they are directing where benefits go, right? And if you vote for the party that's in power, you get a job, working in local government or as a mailman. And so the progressives are trying to break that up, and one of the strategies they had was to change election timing, and sometimes strategically. So if they were better organized, if the progressives thought they were better organized than the political party, then they'd be like, let's move it to off cycle. So then we can boom, overwhelm them and get people elected. And then anyway, and so, or if they felt that the national party was maybe a little bit better organized, then maybe let's not mess with the election timing. So there's some evidence that was going on. I think there was also like an attitude too among the progressives that the masses were not prepared for democracy, or not as informed, and that they were the ones like giving power to the political machine for these jobs. So let's do things so that fewer of the unwashed masses in their mind are showing up to vote, right? And one thing is, change the election timing. Have it be in April, and no one's going to remember, not even that guy who studies local politics for is living. So that's also, I think, part of the strategy. And then like, so California was mostly all, for example, off cycle. And it's just kind of the way they did it, developed it, and they all did at-large elections as well. And then, yeah. And then some of it, I think there might have been an effort to try to also separate partisan politics from city politics. And then from there, it's just like Utah's, I think, been this way, I think, since the beginning of the state. There's efforts in California to change it for some of these concerns to be actually on cycle. So there's been movements to do that. So, yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
I have actually a couple of questions, but I will just ask one. I'm wondering if you could speak to, I know you said earlier just to me that you were thinking about doing research on this, but your hunches around what vote by mail does to turn out, which then maybe changes some of your, right? And
Yes. So, I was being asked here is what happens with like moving to vote by mail. And so Utah, for example, has been a leader in the country in moving to mostly all vote by mail, same with like Washington. So there's been some research that's shown and done by one of my colleagues at BYU that finds that at least with national and congressional presidential elections, it doesn't seem to affect turnout, even though it seems to really lower those costs of voting, right? But because everybody hears about it in the news, are already animated to vote, their partisanship is at play as well. Anyway, they still show up to vote either way. It doesn't seem to matter. But there's not research that's looked at it with local elections that are in a weird time. So in Utah, at least, I mean, this is just anecdotal, like in Provo, like turnout went from like 10% to like 30% last election. But I don't know systematically, is that just happened in Provo? Is that happening everywhere? My hunch is that it will increase turnout in the off-cycle elections. It will make it harder for like an organized interest group to then have as much influence, probably would be my guess, is what we would see. Yeah. But I'm also bringing this up more for this talk to just say, well, look, this is evidence that elections matter because the timing matters. So that means, it's affecting who wins and who loses. So whether elections are off cycle, on cycle, vote by mail or not, I still think it's a good idea to get involved and vote. So. Yeah.
thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Goodbye to everyone out there. So I'll stop the share. Oh, should I see if there's any other questions in the audience? Okay.
No, I think you're gonna send it.
All right.
So we'll record. Yeah.
You want me to stop recording?
Yeah. Just
Okay.
hit end and it will stop it. And we're going to post it on our YouTube.